The road of no return rain hammered against the windshield like bullets, obscuring visibility and transforming the narrow dirt road into a dark tunnel that seemed to swallow everything whole. Sarah sat in the back seat, staring through the fogged window at the towering Douglas firs lining both sides of the road like silent sentinels from a forgotten age. "How much longer, David?" her friend Emma asked from the passenger seat, her voice carrying an undertone of anxiety. David gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the treacherous road ahead. "GPS says 10 minutes, but with this weather, maybe 15. In the back seat beside Sarah, Mark fiddled with his professional camera, checking lenses and settings. "This weather is perfect for filming. The fog, the rain, the low light. Our documentary is going to be epic. If we find anything to film at all," Emma muttered with mild sarcasm. "We will," David said firmly, his jaw set with determination. "Dr. Morrison's research is solid. Multiple sightings in this area over the past 3 months. Footprints, strange vocalizations recorded on audio equipment. Something is out there." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She'd been skeptical when David first proposed this expedition to the Olympic National Forest in Washington state. A documentary about Bigfoot seemed like a joke, a waste of their spring break. But David had been obsessed with cryptozoology since childhood, and when he'd shown them Dr. Morrison's research, a retired anthropologist who'd spent 20 years studying Sasquatch sightings, even Sarah had to admit there was something compelling about it. The SUV lurched violently as the right tire hit a deep puddle, spraying muddy water across the windows. Emma gasped and clutched the door handle. "Easy, David," Mark called out, steadying his camera equipment. "Sorry," David muttered, slowing down slightly. "This road is worse than I expected." The forest pressed in around them, dense and primordial. The trees here were ancient, some of them hundreds of years old, their massive trunks disappearing into the mist above. Moss and lichen covered everything, giving the landscape an otherworldly prehistoric quality. As they drove deeper into the wilderness, cell phone signal had vanished an hour ago, and the last sign of human civilization, a lonely gas station, was now 15 miles behind them. "There," David suddenly exclaimed, pointing ahead. "The marker Dr. Morrison mentioned." Through the rain, Sarah could make out a weathered wooden post on the left side of the road, partially obscured by ferns. Crude letters had been carved into it. "Henderson Cabin, 1.5 mi." David turned onto an even narrower path, barely wide enough for the vehicle. Branches scraped against the sides of the SUV with an unsettling screech. The canopy overhead grew thicker, blocking out what little daylight remained. It was only 4 p.m., but it felt like dusk. After what seemed like an eternity of bumping over roots and rocks, the cabin finally materialized through the trees. It was larger than Sarah had expected, a 2-story log structure with a covered porch nestled in a small clearing. Abandoned for over a decade, according to Dr. Morrison, but still structurally sound. The perfect base camp for their week-long expedition. David killed the engine, and for a moment they all sat in silence, listening to the rain drumming on the roof and the wind moaning through the trees. The sound was hypnotic, almost alive. "Well," Mark said, breaking the spell, "let's get unpacked before it gets dark." The interior of the cabin was musty and cold but dry. Dust covered every surface and cobwebs hung from the corners like tattered curtains. The main room held a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, and a threadbare couch. A steep staircase led to the second floor where 2 small bedrooms waited, each with a single window overlooking the forest. "Girls get the bedrooms. We'll take the couch and sleeping bags down here," David announced, already hauling gear inside. They spent the next 2 hours unloading equipment, setting up their base camp and getting a fire going in the fireplace. The cabin slowly came to life with warmth and light, pushing back the encroaching darkness outside. Emma and Sarah prepared a simple dinner of canned soup and bread while David and Mark tested their equipment. Cameras, audio recorders, motion-activated trail cameras, and thermal imaging devices. "Tomorrow we'll scout the area," David explained, spreading a topographical map across the table. Dr. Morrison marked 3 locations where sightings occurred. Here, by this creek about 2 miles north. Here, near an old logging road to the east. And here, at something called Devil's Rock, about 3 miles west. "Devil's Rock?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's encouraging." "Local legend," Mark said, reading from his tablet. named by settlers in the 1890s. The indigenous tribes who lived here before called it something else, but the meaning was similar. Place where demons dance, or something like that. Supposedly a sacred site where they believed the forest spirits dwelled. Perfect, Emma said dryly. We're camping near a place called Devil's Rock where demons dance. What could go wrong? As night fell completely, the true isolation of their location became apparent. Beyond the cabin's glowing windows, the darkness was absolute. No street lights, no distant house lights, no moon or stars visible through the thick cloud cover. Just impenetrable blackness and the incessant rain. They ate dinner by firelight, trying to keep the conversation light. But Sarah noticed everyone kept glancing toward the windows, toward that waiting darkness. Around 9 p.m., they heard the first sound. It started low and distant, barely audible over the rain, a long, mournful call that rose and fell like a wolf's howl, but deeper, more resonant. It seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing through the forest. Everyone froze, utensils halfway to their mouths. What was that? Emma whispered. Mark was already scrambling for the audio recorder. Did you get it? Tell me you got it. David rewound the digital recorder, and they listened to the playback. The sound was there, unmistakable and haunting. It raised goosebumps on Sarah's arms. Could be a elk, Emma suggested hopefully. Or maybe a bear. Elk don't sound like that, David said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. And bears don't vocalize that way. That was something else. They waited in tense silence for the sound to repeat, but the night remained quiet except for the rain and wind. After half an hour, they began to relax, though sleep came slowly for all of them that night. Sarah lay in her sleeping bag in the upstairs bedroom, listening to Emma's breathing in the bed across from her. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Through the window, she could see nothing but darkness and the vague shapes of trees. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the undergrowth outside. They moved around the cabin slowly, methodically, as if something was circling the structure. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to wake Emma, to call down to the guys, but fear paralyzed her vocal cords. The footsteps stopped directly beneath her window. Sarah barely breathed, straining to hear. For a long moment there was nothing. Then came a sound that would haunt her dreams, a deep, rumbling growl that vibrated through the cabin walls, so low it was almost subsonic, felt more than heard. Then silence. Sarah didn't sleep again that night. Morning revelations dawn brought weak gray light filtering through the mist. Sarah came downstairs to find David already awake, standing on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring intently at the ground. Look at this, he said without preamble when he heard her approach. Sarah followed his gaze and felt her blood run cold. In the soft mud around the cabin were footprints, massive footprints, easily 16 inches long and 7 inches wide, with 5 distinct toes. They circled the entire structure, exactly as Sarah had heard during the night. "Oh my God," she breathed. "I know." David's voice trembled with barely suppressed excitement. "I found them 10 minutes ago." "I've already photographed and measured them." "Sarah, these are fresh. Last night. Whatever made these was here." Mark emerged from the cabin, camera already in hand, and nearly dropped it when he saw the prints. Emma appeared moments later and went pale. "This is incredible," Mark whispered, filming everything. The stride length, the depth of the impression. Whatever made these had to weigh at least 600 pounds. "Could someone be messing with us?" Emma asked, her voice small and frightened. "Like someone with fake feet?" David shook his head. "Look at the depth variation in the print, the way the toes grip the mud. You can see dermal ridges here, like fingerprints. These are real, Emma. Something bipedal and massive walked around our cabin last night." Sarah swallowed hard. "I heard it." All eyes turned to her. "Last night, around 2 a.m. maybe. I heard footsteps circling the cabin. And then, a growl. A really deep growl that I could feel in my chest." David grabbed her shoulders, his eyes intense. "Why didn't you wake us?" "I was terrified. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I thought maybe I was imagining it, that it was just fear playing tricks on me." "This is real," David said firmly. "We're really onto something here. Dr. Morrison was right. They spent the morning documenting everything, taking plaster casts of the best prints, collecting soil samples, and reviewing all their recording equipment. The motion-activated cameras they'd set up around the perimeter had been triggered multiple times during the night. But frustratingly, the images showed only darkness and rain, with occasional glimpses of something large moving just beyond the range of the infrared lights. One image, however, made everyone stop cold. Taken at 2:17 a.m. by the camera on the north side of the cabin, it showed a massive dark silhouette standing upright among the trees, easily 8 or 9 feet tall. The resolution was poor, the figure partially obscured by foliage, but the shape was unmistakably humanoid. Broad shoulders, long arms, a cone-shaped head. "That's it," Mark whispered. "That's Bigfoot." After a hurried breakfast, they prepared for their first expedition into the forest. The plan was to hike to the creek where Dr. Morrison had recorded multiple sightings. David insisted they travel as a group. No one goes anywhere alone. The forest was a maze of towering trees, tangled undergrowth, and moss-covered logs. Mist clung to the ground, reducing visibility to 20 feet. Every sound seemed amplified. The drip of water from leaves, the crack of twigs underfoot, the distant cry of birds. They reached the creek after an hour of hiking. It was wider than expected, maybe 15 feet across, the water running fast and clear over smooth stones. The banks were thick with ferns and devil's club, their thorny stems creating natural barriers. According to Dr. Morrison's notes, David said, consulting his tablet, "There's a game trail along the north bank that shows unusually large tracks regularly. Animals avoid it. They found the trail easily enough, a wide path through the undergrowth, too big for deer, too deliberate for random animal movement. And there, in the soft earth, were more footprints, dozens of them, layered over each other, some fresh, some older. The trail followed the creek upstream, disappearing into the thick forest. We follow it," David decided. "Is that wise?" Emma asked nervously. "We're literally following the path of something that visited our cabin last night." "That's exactly why we're here," Mark said, already filming. "This is what we came for." They moved carefully along the trail, cameras and recorders running constantly. The forest seemed to grow denser, darker, more oppressive. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes tracked their every movement. After half a mile, they found something that made David stop so abruptly that Sarah bumped into him. "Look," he whispered, pointing. A massive cedar tree, at least 6 feet in diameter, stood beside the trail. About 7 feet up its trunk, 4 parallel gashes had been carved into the bark, deep gouges that wept sap. They were fresh, the exposed wood still pale. "Claw marks," Mark said unnecessarily. "No," David corrected, reaching up to touch the marks carefully. "Look at the spacing, the depth. These weren't made by claws. These were made by fingers. Something with enormous hands and incredible strength marked this tree. A territorial marker, Sarah realized with growing dread. They were in something's territory, and it knew they were there." The sound came again then. That same mournful call they'd heard the night before, but much closer now, echoing through the trees ahead of them. It was answered by another call from behind them, and then another from the left. 3 of them. They were surrounded. "Back to the cabin," David said urgently. "Now, stay together and move fast." They ran. The run back to the cabin was nightmarish. The forest seemed to come alive around them, branches whipping at their faces, roots trying to trip them, the mist thickening until they could barely see 10 feet ahead. The calls continued, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always from different directions, as if the creatures were coordinating, hurting them. They burst through the cabin door, slamming it behind them, gasping for breath. David immediately began checking all the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. "That was them," Mark said between breaths. His face flushed with adrenaline. "That was really them. Multiple individuals. Did you hear how they were calling to each other?" "They were surrounding us," Emma said, her voice shaking. "They were hunting us." "We don't know that," David said, but his tone lacked conviction. "They might have just been curious, investigating intruders in their territory." Sarah went to the window, peering out at the forest. Somewhere out there, in that green darkness, something watched and waited. She could feel it. They spent the rest of the day inside, reviewing footage and audio, debating their next move. The evidence they'd gathered was extraordinary. The footprints, the tree marking, the coordinated vocalizations. David was ecstatic, convinced they were on the verge of the discovery of the century. But as afternoon faded to evening, the atmosphere in the cabin grew tense. Emma wanted to pack up and leave immediately. Mark was torn between fear and professional ambition. The footage they had was incredible, but was it worth the risk? David refused to even consider leaving, insisting they were perfectly safe inside the cabin. Sarah said little, but her mind raced. Something about the morning's encounter bothered her. The way the creatures had called to each other, the deliberate nature of their movements. It felt less like wild animals and more like calculated intelligence, and that frightened her more than anything. As darkness fell, they secured the cabin as best they could, blocking the downstairs windows with furniture, keeping all lights on, maintaining a fire in the fireplace. David and Mark took turns on watch, armed with flare guns, the only weapons they'd brought. Around midnight, it started. Rocks began hitting the cabin, small stones at first, then larger ones, slamming into the walls and roof with alarming force. Then came the wood knocking, a distinct rhythmic banging sound, like someone striking tree trunks together, coming from multiple directions in the forest. Crack, 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 crack. The sound was deafening, primal, territorial. Sarah covered her ears, but she could still feel the vibrations through the floor. Then came the screams, not howls or calls, but screams, high-pitched, agonized sounds that seemed almost human but not quite, full of rage and hunger. They pierced the night, overlapping and echoing until it was impossible to tell how many creatures were out there. Emma was crying, curled up on the couch. Mark had gone pale, his camera forgotten. Even David looked shaken, his earlier confidence crumbling. What do they want? Emma sobbed. They're trying to scare us, David said. It's intimidation behavior. They want us to leave. Then let's leave, Emma shouted. Let's get in the car and go right now. We can't drive that road in the dark, David argued. We'd crash. We're safer here, inside, until morning. The assault continued for hours. Rocks, wood knocking, screams, and occasionally, the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch, testing the door. Something scratched at the walls, a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard amplified 1,000 times. No one slept that night. Dawn brought relief but no comfort. The cacophony stopped with the first light, but when they cautiously opened the door, the sight that greeted them was chilling. The clearing around the cabin had been vandalized. Small trees had been uprooted and laid in strange patterns, X shapes and circles that seemed deliberate. Larger logs had been stacked into crude structures, and everywhere, scattered like a grotesque calling card, were bones, deer bones, elk bones, smaller animal remains, all stripped clean and arranged in piles. Oh God, Emma whispered, clutching Sarah's arm. Most disturbing was what they found on the porch. 3 massive handprints in mud, pressed against the door, the fingers splayed wide. Each hand was enormous, easily twice the size of a human hand. They were testing the door, Mark said quietly, trying to figure out how to get in. David photographed everything methodically, but Sarah could see his hands shaking. His academic excitement had given way to fear. We need to call for help, Emma said firmly. We'll hike back to where we get cell signal and call the rangers. And tell them what? David asked. That Bigfoot is attacking us? They'll think we're crazy. And if we leave, we abandon all our equipment, all our evidence. I don't care about the evidence, Emma shouted. I care about staying alive. They argued for an hour, voices rising, nerves fraying. Finally, they reached a compromise. David and Mark would stay with the equipment, while Emma and Sarah would take the SUV and drive to get help. They'd be back by nightfall with rangers or police or whoever they could find. Stay inside. Keep the fire going. Don't go out for any reason, Emma instructed David as she gathered her things. Promise me, I promise, David said, hugging her. Be careful. Drive slowly. Sarah and Emma packed quickly, grabbed the car keys, and headed for the SUV. But when they reached it, Sarah's heart sank. All 4 tires had been slashed, not punctured, but torn open. The sidewalls shredded as if by massive claws. The hood had been dented, and when David, who had followed them out, opened it, they found the battery missing, simply ripped out of its housing. Cables snapped. No, Emma whispered. No. They were trapped. We walked then, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. It's 15 miles to the gas station. We can make it in 5 or 6 hours. David shook his head violently. Too dangerous. You saw what they did to the car. They'll track you in the forest. At least here we have shelter, walls. Then we're prisoners, Emma said bitterly. A sound made them all freeze, branches breaking in the tree line, moving toward them. They ran back inside the cabin, bolting the door behind them. Through the window, Sarah saw it clearly for the first time. It stepped out from behind a massive cedar, standing fully upright. At least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur matted with mud and debris. Its shoulders were impossibly broad. Its arms hung past its knees, ending in huge, human-like hands. But it was the face that paralyzed Sarah, a flat, ape-like visage, but with something disturbingly human in the eyes, an intelligence that was calculating and cold. It stared directly at the cabin, directly at Sarah through the window. Then it opened its mouth and screamed, that same ear-splitting shriek from the night before, a sound of pure aggression and dominance. It was joined by 2 others, emerging from different points in the forest. One slightly smaller, one massive, easily 9 feet tall. A family group, Sarah realized. And they were coordinating, communicating with grunts and gestures. The creatures began their siege in earnest. They threw rocks at the cabin with frightening accuracy, shattering one window despite the furniture barricade. They charged the walls, slamming into them with their shoulders, making the entire structure shake. The largest one picked up a fallen log and used it as a battering ram against the door. Inside, the 4 friends huddled together, knowing that if the door gave way, it was over. The siege lasted all day. The creatures would attack for an hour, then withdraw into the forest, then return renewed. They were systematically testing the cabin's defenses, learning, adapting. The door was holding, but barely. The frame had begun to splinter, and with each impact, the damage worsened. As afternoon wore into evening, exhaustion set in. They hadn't slept in over 30 hours. Fear had given way to numbness, terror to a kind of resigned dread. They took turns keeping watch while others dozed fitfully. Around 7 p.m., David noticed something. They've stopped. It was true. The forest had gone silent. No more impacts, no more screams, no movement visible through the windows. Just stillness. Maybe they gave up, Emma said hopefully. Or they're trying a different approach, Mark said grimly. They waited in tense silence. An hour passed. 2 hours. The fire had burned low, and they were running out of firewood. The pile they'd brought inside was nearly depleted. We need more wood, David finally said. The temperature's dropping. Without the fire, we'll freeze by morning. There's a woodshed behind the cabin, Mark remembered, about 20 feet away. Saw it when we arrived. Too risky, Sarah said immediately. They could be waiting. I'll be fast, Mark argued. In and out in 30 seconds. You guys cover me from the door. Despite their protests, Mark was adamant. He'd make the run, grab as much wood as he could carry, and dash back. Simple. David gave him the flare gun. Anything moves, you fire this and run. We'll have the door open. Mark nodded, took a deep breath, and slipped out the back door. Sarah, David, and Emma crowded at the door, watching tensely as Mark sprinted through the gathering darkness to the woodshed. He disappeared inside, and they could hear him loading wood. Come on, Mark, Emma whispered. Hurry. 15 seconds. 20. 30. Mark emerged from the shed, arms full of split logs, and started back toward the cabin. He was halfway there when it happened. A massive dark shape dropped from the trees above. They hadn't been watching from the forest. They'd been in the trees, waiting overhead. The creature landed directly in Mark's path with an earth-shaking thud. Mark screamed, dropped the wood, raised the flare gun, and fired. The flare hit the creature in the chest, igniting its fur, but it barely flinched. Instead, it reached out with one enormous arm and grabbed Mark around the waist. Mark! Emma shrieked. David bolted out the door, but Sarah grabbed him, holding him back as the creature lifted Mark off the ground like he weighed nothing. Mark struggled, screaming, beating at the creature's arm. But it was useless. The creature looked directly at them. Sarah would never forget those eyes, burning with primal fury, then turned and bounded into the forest with impossible speed, disappearing into the darkness in seconds. Mark's screams fading as he was carried away, then silence. Emma collapsed, sobbing. David stood frozen, face white with shock. Sarah slowly closed and bolted the door, her mind numb, unable to process what she'd just witnessed. Mark was gone. They didn't sleep. They couldn't. Emma was catatonic, rocking back and forth on the couch, tears streaming silently down her face. David paced like a caged animal, alternating between self-recrimination, I should have gone, not him, and desperate planning. We'll find him at first light. We have to find him. Sarah kept watch at the window, the flare gun clutched in her trembling hands, though she knew it was useless. The creatures were toying with them. If they wanted to get inside, they would. The forest remained eerily quiet. No more screams, no more attacks. But Sarah could feel them out there, watching, waiting. The cabin had become their prison, and something in those woods had taken their friend. Around 3 a.m., Emma finally spoke, her voice hoarse and broken. He's dead, isn't he? Sarah wanted to lie, to offer comfort, but couldn't find the words. We're all going to die here, Emma continued flatly. This is how it ends. We came looking for monsters and we found them. Stop it, David said sharply. We're getting out of here. When the sun rises, we make a run for it. Follow the road back to civilization. Stay together, move fast. They'll chase us, Sarah said quietly. They're faster than us, stronger than us. They know this forest. We don't. Then what do you suggest? David snapped, his composure finally cracking. We just wait here to die? Sarah looked at him, then at Emma, then back out at the darkness. I suggest we try to understand them. They're not mindless animals. They've been strategic, coordinated. They cut us off from escape. They've been testing our defenses, learning. They communicate with each other. David, you said it yourself. They show intelligence. What's your point? My point is, maybe we can communicate back. Maybe we can negotiate. David stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Negotiate? Sarah, they took Mark. They've been terrorizing us for 2 days. And why? Sarah pressed. Because we invaded their territory. We're the intruders here. What if we offer to leave? What if we can make them understand we mean no harm? That's insane, Emma whispered. Maybe it was. But as the hours crawled toward dawn, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that violence wasn't the answer here. These creatures, these Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever they weren't evil. They were protecting their home, and humanity had given them every reason to fear and hate us. When the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the windows, Sarah made her decision. I'm going out there. Absolutely not, David said immediately. Listen to me, Sarah said firmly. We're out of options. We have no transportation, no way to call for help, and they've proven they can overpower us whenever they want. Our only chance is to try to communicate, to show we're not a threat. They'll kill you, Emma said. Maybe. Or maybe they'll listen. Sarah took a deep breath. I'm going to the tree line, unarmed, hands visible. I'll try to make contact. If they attack, at least you two might have a chance to run while they're distracted. Before they could stop her, Sarah opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, washed by recent rain. Mist coiled through the trees like living things. Sarah's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. But she forced herself to walk slowly, calmly, toward the tree line where the creatures had emerged yesterday. She stopped about 30 feet from the forest edge, well within view of the cabin, but also clearly visible to whatever watched from the trees. Then she sat down on the wet ground, cross-legged, hands palm up on her knees in a gesture of non-aggression, and she waited. Minutes passed. 5. 10. Sarah focused on keeping her breathing steady, on projecting calm despite the terror coursing through her. Behind her, she knew David and Emma were watching from the window, probably thinking she'd gone mad. Maybe she had. Then she heard it. A soft footfall in the underbrush. Another. Something was approaching, moving through the forest with surprising quietness for something so large. The creature emerged from behind a tree about 40 feet away. It was the female, Sarah thought, the smaller of the three they'd seen. About 7 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown fur that was matted and thorny with debris. It watched Sarah with dark, intelligent eyes, head tilted slightly, assessing. Sarah didn't move, didn't speak. She simply sat, hands open, meeting the creature's gaze steadily, but without challenge. The creature took a step closer, then another. It moved with surprising grace despite its size and bulk. When it was about 20 feet away, it stopped and made a sound. A low, rumbling vocalization, not aggressive almost, questioning. Sarah swallowed hard. Then slowly, deliberately, she raised one hand and placed it over her heart. Friend, she said softly. Then she pointed at the creature. You, friend. It was absurd, trying to communicate with gestures and simp. Low words. But the creature's reaction was immediate and shocking. It mimicked Sarah's gesture, placing its enormous hand over its own chest, then pointed at Sarah. Communication. Actual communication. Encouraged, Sarah continued. She pointed back at the cabin, then made a walking away gesture with her fingers. We leave, go away. She repeated the gesture several times, trying to make her meaning clear. We leave your home, we go. No come back, the creature watched intently. Then it did something that made Sarah's breath catch. It gestured toward the forest, then made a harsh, violent gesture, shaking its head. The message was clear. No, you don't leave. Not yet. Why? Sarah asked, though she knew it couldn't understand the word. What do you want? The creature made a different gesture then, pointing at Sarah, then at the cabin, then making a gathering motion. It wanted them together. All of them, my friends. Sarah pointed at the cabin. The creature nodded. Actually nodded. A distinctly human gesture that was somehow more terrifying for its familiarity. Then the creature turned and vocalized into the forest 3 distinct hoots. It was calling the others. Sarah's courage faltered as the 2 males emerged from different directions. The massive alpha male, at least 9 feet of raw power, and the middle male who had taken Mark. They formed a loose semicircle around Sarah, trapping her, but they didn't attack. Instead, the alpha male raised one enormous hand, then pointed insistently at the forest behind him. The gesture was unmistakable. Come, follow. You want us to come with you? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Into the forest? The alpha made the gesture again, more insistent. Then he did something that made Sarah's blood run cold. He reached into the thick fur on his chest and pulled out something small and rectangular. Mark's wallet. He held it up, showing it to Sarah, then pointed into the forest again. Mark. They were offering to take them to Mark. Sarah slowly stood. The creatures tensed but didn't move. She backed away carefully, maintaining eye contact, then turned and walked back to the cabin. What the hell was that? David demanded as she entered. Did you just communicate with them? They want us to follow them, Sarah said, her voice shaky but determined. Into the forest, I think. I think they have Mark, or they're offering to show us where he is. It's a trap, Emma said immediately. Maybe, Sarah admitted. But what choice do we have? We can't stay here forever. We can't escape. Maybe this is our only chance. David looked torn, but finally nodded. Okay, we go. But we stay alert, stay together, and at the first sign of danger. There won't be anything we can do, Sarah interrupted gently. If they want to hurt us, they can. Our only chance is to trust them. Trust them. Emma's voice rose hysterically. They've been terrorizing us. They took Mark. And now they're offering to take us to him, Sarah said. Maybe there's more to this than we understand. Minutes later, the 3 of them emerged from the cabin, each carrying only water and a small pack. The 3 creatures waited patiently at the tree line. When the humans approached, the alpha male turned and began walking into the forest. The female gestured for them to follow, while the middle male took up the rear. They were being escorted, Sarah realized. Guarded. Led somewhere for a purpose they couldn't yet comprehend. The march into the forest began. They walked for hours, deeper into the wilderness than Sarah thought possible. The trail, if it could be called that, wound through dense undergrowth, over streams, up steep hillsides. The creatures moved with ease, but the humans struggled, exhausted and stumbling. Yet whenever one of them fell behind, the female would wait patiently, even offering her hand once to help Emma over a fallen log. It was surreal, terrifying, and strangely not hostile. The creatures weren't attacking. They were guiding. Around midday, they reached a place where the forest changed. The trees here were even older, even more massive, ancient giants that had stood for centuries. The air itself felt different, charged with something Sarah couldn't name. Sacred, maybe. The word popped into her head unbidden. The alpha male stopped at the edge of a large clearing and turned to face them. Then he pointed ahead and vocalized softly, not a scream or a roar, but an almost gentle sound. They entered the clearing. What Sarah saw there would haunt her forever. It was a burial ground. Dozens of stone cairns dotted the clearing, each carefully constructed, each marking a grave. But these weren't recent. Moss and lichen covered the stones. Some of them had clearly stood for decades. This was a sacred place, a cemetery where the creatures honored their dead. And there, in the center of the clearing, tied to a tree but alive and unharmed, was Mark. "Oh my God." Emma screamed, running toward him. David and Sarah followed, Sarah's mind reeling. Mark was crying, tears streaming down his face, but he was uninjured. The creatures had bound him with vines, but not cruelly, more like they were keeping him still, preventing him from wandering off. As they untied him, Sarah noticed something else. Behind Mark, freshly placed, was a new cairn, smaller than the others, and beside it, carefully arranged, were objects. A child's wooden toy, carved from wood. Small bones lovingly placed. "They brought me here yesterday," Mark gasped as the vines fell away. "I thought they were going to kill me, but they just left me here, fed me, gave me water. I didn't understand. Sarah did." Suddenly, horribly, she understood everything. She turned to face the alpha male, who stood at the clearing's edge with the other two, watching. "The cabin," she said slowly. "Henderson cabin. That was your territory, wasn't it? Always yours." The alpha didn't respond, but Sarah continued, pieces falling into place. "The Hendersons, the family that built that cabin 10 years ago. They disappeared. Everyone thought they left, but they didn't, did they? You drove them away. Or worse." She pointed at the fresh cairn. That's why you attacked them. Because they hurt your family. They killed your child." The female made a low, mournful sound, moving to stand beside the small grave. Her grief was palpable, so clearly human in its depth that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "Hunters, probably," David whispered, understanding now too. "Trophy hunters came into this forest, found these creatures, and killed one. A young one. And you've been protecting your territory ever since," Sarah said to the alpha. "Driving away any humans who come here. Not because you're monsters, but because we proved to you that we are." The alpha male watched her with those dark, ancient eyes. Then he reached down and picked up something from beside the grave, a rifle casing. Old, weathered, but unmistakably human. He held it out to Sarah, and in that gesture was everything: accusation, grief, rage, and a terrible, tragic understanding. "Your kind did this." Sarah took the casing with a shaking hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." They stayed in the clearing for hours as the truth unfolded in gestures, expressions, and broken communication. The creatures, Sarah refused to call them monsters anymore, were intelligent, emotional beings with a complex social structure. The three they'd encountered were a family: the alpha male, the father, the female, the mother, and the younger male, an older offspring. 3 years ago, hunters had come to this area. Not researchers or documentarians, but trophy hunters looking for proof of Bigfoot's existence. They'd found this family and, in an act of senseless violence, shot and killed the youngest child, a toddler by Sasquatch standards, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. The creatures had driven the hunters away, but the damage was done. In their grief and rage, they'd become territorial, aggressive toward any human presence. The Henderson family had built their cabin right in the heart of this territory. When they refused to leave after repeated warnings, the creatures had escalated. Sarah suspected the Hendersons hadn't just disappeared. They'd been killed, though the creatures weren't offering those details. "Dr. Morrison's research," David said quietly. "All those sightings, all that evidence. We weren't the first to come here. Others have been investigating this area for years, and every time humans come, they bring more danger," Emma added, her voice hollow. "More risk. These creatures, they're just trying to survive, to protect what's left of their family." Mark had been taken not to be killed, but as a hostage, leveraged to force the rest of them to come here, to this sacred place, to understand. It was a test, Sarah realized. The creatures wanted to see if humans were capable of empathy, of seeing them as something more than cryptids or trophies. The question was, what happened now? As afternoon shadows lengthened, the alpha male approached Sarah directly. He made a gesture, pointing at her, then at her friends, then sweeping his arm toward the direction they'd come from. The meaning was clear: you may leave now. But then he made another gesture, one more complex. He pointed at himself, then at the forest, then made a pushing motion toward Sarah. "Stay away. Tell others to stay away. You want us to keep your secret," Sarah said. To tell people not to come here? The Alpha nodded emphatically. Then he did something that broke Sarah's heart. He reached out with one massive hand and gently touched her shoulder. Not a threat, but a plea. Please, I understand, Sarah whispered. I promise. David stepped forward. All the footage we recorded, all the evidence, we'll destroy it, all of it. No documentary, no proof. This place, your family, it stays secret. The female made a soft, appreciative sound. But how do we explain Mark's disappearance? Emma asked. People will, SK questions. Search parties will come. That was the problem, wasn't it? They couldn't tell the truth, but any lie would invite investigation, bring more humans into this forest. Sarah thought hard, then said, We tell them we got lost. That in the storm and confusion, Mark wandered off and we couldn't find him. After 3 days of searching, we had to hike out for help. By the time we got back with rangers, we found him. Dehydrated, hypothermic, but alive. He was disoriented, couldn't remember exactly where he'd been, just wandered in circles until we found him. That could work, David said slowly, especially if we delete all the footage, all the evidence. It becomes just a survival story. No Bigfoot, no mystery. Just stupid college kids who got in over their heads in the wilderness. We'll have to make it convincing, Mark added, his voice still shaky.
Act traumatized enough that no one wants to push too hard with questions. That won't be hard, Emma said bitterly.
I am traumatized. The alpha male had been watching this exchange carefully. Now he turned and vocalized into the forest, a long, complex series of hoots and grunts. Sarah wondered if he was calling others, summoning the pack. Instead, a much older creature emerged from the trees. A massive male, grizzled and scarred, moving slowly with age. The elder, Sarah realized. The grandfather or patriarch of the clan. This ancient being approached them, studying each human with eyes that held impossible wisdom. When he reached Sarah, he touched her face with surprising gentleness, his leathery palm rough but not threatening. Then he reached into the thick fur at his chest and withdrew something, a gift. It was a carved wooden pendant hanging on a woven cord. The carving depicted a human and a Sasquatch standing side by side. Crude but beautiful, the work of years. The elder placed it in Sarah's hand and closed her fingers around it. A reminder, Sarah whispered, understanding. Of this moment, of the promise. The elder nodded, then vocalized softly, a sound that seemed to say, Remember us. Protect us, I will, Sarah promised. We all will. The creatures guided them back, but by a different route. Faster, easier, as if they were finally comfortable letting the humans see the true paths through their territory. They moved through the twilight, the forest alive with evening sounds, and Sarah noticed details she'd missed before in her fear. There were signs of habitation everywhere, if you knew to look. Structures woven from branches and leaves, half hidden in the undergrowth, carefully maintained trails, trees marked with symbols that might have been territorial markers or directional signs. This wasn't just a forest to these beings, it was home, as complex and meaningful as any human settlement. They passed another clearing where 3 younger Sasquatch, adolescents maybe, watched from a distance with curious eyes. The alpha male hooted at them, and they melted back into the trees, protecting the young ones, Sarah realized, keeping them away from the potentially dangerous humans. As they neared the cabin, the creatures stopped. The alpha male pointed ahead, indicating the humans should continue alone. But before they parted, each creature approached each human in turn, touching their shoulders in what seemed like a farewell gesture. When the female came to Sarah, she did something unexpected. She pulled Sarah into a gentle embrace, her arms encircling the human carefully. Sarah could feel the creature's heart beating, slow and steady and so very alive. The female vocalized softly, and though Sarah didn't understand the words, she understood the meaning. Thank you. Take care of your family, Sarah whispered back. Stay safe. Then the creatures were gone. Melting into the forest so quickly and silently, it was as if they'd never been there at all. The 4 friends stood alone in the gathering darkness, the cabin waiting ahead of them, unchanged despite everything that had happened. We should destroy the equipment, David said quietly. All of it. Tonight. They spent the next few hours methodically erasing every video file, every audio recording, every photograph. David smashed the SD cards, burned the papers with Dr. Morrison's research notes, deleted every backup file from the laptops and phones. Years of investigation. Extraordinary evidence of an undiscovered species. All destroyed. Emma watched the fire consume the last of the photographs and said, "Dr. Morrison is going to be devastated." "Dr. Morrison never has to know," David replied. "We'll tell him we found nothing. The sightings were misidentified bears, the sounds were elk, the footprints were hoaxes. Just another dead end in a decades-long search." "He'll be disappointed," Mark said, "but he'll move on. Keep searching elsewhere." "Good," Sarah said firmly. "He should search elsewhere. These creatures, this family, they deserve to be left alone." As they packed up the next morning, preparing for the long hike back to civilization, Sarah looked back at the forest one last time. She touched the wooden pendant hidden beneath her shirt, the one piece of evidence she'd kept, the only proof that any of this had happened. Somewhere in those trees, a family of Sasquatch watched them leave. Sarah couldn't see them, but she felt their presence, their eyes following the humans' departure, making sure they really left. She sent a silent prayer into that green darkness. Be safe. Survive. Let your children's children inherit these forests. Let humanity never find you again. Then she turned and followed her friends down the road, leaving the mystery behind. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in her apartment, staring at the news on her laptop. A new logging contract had been approved for the Olympic National Forest. Thousands of acres, including the remote regions near where the cabin stood. Her phone buzzed. A group text from David. "Did you see the news?" "Emma, we have to do something." "Mark, but what?" "We can't tell them why they shouldn't log there." Sarah's fingers trembled as she typed, "Meet at my place. Tonight. We need to talk." When they gathered in her living room hours later, the weight of their shared secret hung heavy in the air. "We can't let them destroy that forest," Emma said immediately. "Those creatures will be displaced, maybe killed. But we can't reveal them either," David countered. "The moment people know they exist, it's over. There would be expeditions, researchers, hunters, tourists. The creatures would be captured, caged, turned into spectacles, or hunted to extinction for trophies." Mark added darkly, "You know someone would try." Sarah had been thinking about this problem for 3 weeks, ever since they'd emerged from the forest with their fabricated story of getting lost. The rangers had believed them. The local news had run a brief story about foolish college kids rescued after a wilderness mishap. And then everyone had moved on. Everyone except them. "We become activists," Sarah said finally. "Environmental activists. We join organizations dedicated to preserving old-growth forests. We don't mention Sasquatch. We talk about endangered species habitat, watershed protection, climate change. We fight the logging through legal normal channels." "That could take years," Emma protested, "and might not work. Do you have a better idea?" Sarah challenged. "This is the only way to protect them without exposing them," David nodded slowly. "She's right. We dedicate ourselves to forest conservation. We make it our life's work. It's the only way to honor our promise." So they did. Over the following months and years, they became tireless advocates for wilderness preservation. David went to law school, specializing in environmental law. Emma became a wildlife biologist, fighting for habitat protection. Mark used his filmmaking skills to create documentaries about forest ecosystems and conservation. Sarah became an organizer, building coalitions and running campaigns. They never mentioned Sasquatch, never hinted at what they'd really encountered. But everything they did, every forest they helped save, every logging contract they managed to block, it was all for that one family in the Olympic National Forest. Sometimes, late at night, Sarah would take out the wooden pendant and hold it, wondering if the creatures were still there, still safe, wondering if they knew that the humans who had invaded their territory were now fighting to protect it. She'd never know. And that was okay. 5 years after their expedition, Sarah stood in a courtroom as a judge read his verdict on the logging case. The contract was invalidated on environmental grounds. The forest would remain protected, added to a new wilderness preserve. That night, she drove back to Washington State, as close to the old forest as she could get without entering it. She stood at the edge of the tree line, under a canopy of stars, and whispered into the darkness, "We kept our promise." The forest was silent. But somewhere in that darkness, Sarah imagined a family of Sasquatch living their lives, hunting, foraging, raising children, honoring their dead. Hidden, safe, free, as it should be, as she turned to leave. A sound drifted from the forest, a long, low call, neither aggressive nor frightened, just acknowledgement. A voice from the wilderness, saying perhaps, "We remember you too." Sarah smiled through her tears and walked back to her car. Behind her, the forest kept its secrets. 20 years later, Sarah stood in that same forest, now an official wilderness preserve. She was older now, gray streaking her hair, but her eyes still held the memory of what she'd seen here. She'd never married, never had children of her own. The forest had become her life's work, her calling. David, Emma, and Mark had similar paths, all of them forever changed by those 3 days when the world had revealed itself to be larger, stranger, and more wonderful than they'd ever imagined. They'd met up every year, returning to Washington, checking on the forest from a distance, making sure it remained protected. But they never went back to the cabin, never ventured onto that old trail. That was sacred ground, not for them. Today was different. Yesterday, Emma had called with news that made Sarah's heart sink. A team of researchers had found remains in the forest. Human remains in a location that matched descriptions of the old Henderson cabin. The case was being reopened. People were asking questions. "We need to control the narrative," David had said urgently, "before someone digs too deep." So here they were, 4 middle-aged former friends, hiking back into their past, preparing to finally tell the partial truth about what had happened to the Henderson family. Not the whole truth, never that, but enough to satisfy investigators and close the case. They would discover evidence suggesting the Hendersons had died in a tragic accident. Victims of the wilderness they'd been too inexperienced to navigate. No mystery, no suspicion of foul play. Just nature being nature. As they hiked the now familiar trails, Sarah noticed changes. The forest had grown denser, wilder. There were fewer signs of human presence than ever. Good. They were halfway to the cabin when Sarah stopped suddenly. There, carved into a massive cedar tree at eye level, was a symbol, the same symbol from the wooden pendant she still wore. A human and a Sasquatch, side by side. It was recent. The wood still pale where bark had been carefully removed. "They remember," Emma whispered, seeing it too. "They're still here," Mark added, wonder in his voice. David reached out and touched the carving gently. "And they want us to know they remember." As if in response, a sound echoed through the forest, a long, familiar call. Neither threat nor greeting, just acknowledgement. The forest remembering the humans who had kept their promise. Sarah smiled, tears streaming down her face. She placed her hand over her heart, then extended it toward the forest. "We remember too," she said. "Always." The 4 of them stood in silence, honored witnesses to a secret that would die with them. The last people to know the truth about the giants that walked these woods. They completed their mission, planting the evidence they'd carefully prepared, creating a plausible explanation for the Henderson disappearance that would satisfy authorities without inviting further investigation. It wasn't honest, but it was necessary. As they hiked back out that evening, Sarah looked back one final time. For just a moment, in the shadows between the trees, she thought she saw them, tall, dark figures watching from the green darkness. A family that had survived against all odds, protected by the very species that had threatened them. She raised her hand in farewell, and though it might have been her imagination, she thought she saw a large hand raise in response, a gesture of peace between 2 worlds that would never meet again. The forest closed around them as they left, ancient and eternal, keeping its secrets safe. Some mysteries, Sarah thought, are meant to remain unsolved. Some truths are too precious to ever speak aloud, and some promises are worth keeping forever. In memory of all the wilderness places and the wonders they hold, known and unknown, seen and unseen, may we have the wisdom to protect what we don't understand and the courage to leave some mysteries unsolved.